Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the YouTube channel grecochess, the channel of the game of chess, where we discuss, we analyze, we comment, and we talk about the aspects of the game of chess. I'm your host. My name is ThanosZito, and for the last few days, unfortunately, I've been absent from the world of chess due to personal reasons. As a result, we had no videos for the last few days, and also I had to miss the Chessanity tournament that took place last Sunday. And in the winter Swiss of the Queen Chess Club, I had to take a bye on round number 5. But in spite of that, I ended up with 3 points, 3 wins, and 1 loss. And although it was points in only 4 rounds, the runner-up had 2.5 out of 5, so at least the under 1700 category, I won the first place. Of course, in the overall category, among all the players, the winner was, no surprise, Jay Bonning with 4.5 out of 5. Jay, congratulations once again. But in this video, we have something special. We're going to show a game requested by one of my subscribers, ThanosZito. I hope I pronounced it correctly. He requested that I'm going to show to you a game that that he played against a player whose username is Carpov1. But first, let me show to you my encounters with Thanos. I'm going to call him Thanos from his first name. You see here, we met at the 2026 Team Greece tournament, 1201 until 1500. These are, of course, the ratings, the daily ratings of chess.com, where he won both of the games against me. Just to tell you that after my performance at the Winter Swiss of the Queen's Chess Club, my United States Chess Federation rating for the first time ever exceeded 1700. It is now 1706, breaking my previous record, 1683, from January 2020. So I'm very happy about that. Thanos, congratulations for the 2 wins against me, and of course for advancing to the second round of the 2026 Team Greece tournament. But I'm not going to show to you a game that you played against me. We have something else, the game I mentioned against Carpov1. And let's go and show the game. So we've got the correct screen. And here we are. I'm going to hide the part of the screen. I'm only going to show a small part of the screen. The reason being that in the rest of the screen, it's pose a surprise. You're going to see how the game continued and ended. Thanos has the white pieces. Thanos, my compatriot from Greece, as you see here, facing Carpov1 from the United States. And let's see how the game begins. The first few moves are book moves. We'll go very briefly through them. Pawn to e4 for Thanos, to d6 for Carpov1, which is the so-called perk defense. Not one of the most common, but it's a book move. It's not unknown. Pawn to d4 for Thanos, of course, 2 pawns occupying the center. Knight to f6 for Carpov1, developing the knight and attacking the pawn on e4. And Thanos defends by sending his knight to c3. In case you wonder why didn't he push his pawn to e5, what's going to happen is after the exchange of the pawns, Carpov1 will take the white queen, Thanos will take it back, but Thanos has lost his castling rights. That is why it's better to defend the pawn. A good way is with the knight to c3. Pawn to d6 for Carpov1, preparing the fianchetto, preparing for the bishop to go to g7 and be placed in the long diagonal that goes from a1 to h8. Bishop to g5 for Thanos and bishop to g7 for Carpov1 that completes the fianchetto. Diagonal is, excuse me, the bishop is on this long diagonal. Of course, it doesn't yet control it because the pieces in the way, but is ready to exert influence, especially if the pieces disappear. And all that was book move until now. We see this little book But now we're going to get out of the book with Thanos placing his bishop to c4, inaccuracies as a computer. The comment of the artificially generated code says that is not the right idea. The computer would prefer a pawn go to f4, but there is a problem with that. You see the green arrow? The problem is that, first of all, pawns don't come back. And this opens diagonal, goes from h4 to e1. And in case of short castling, it also opens the diagonal that ends in g1, where the king will be located. That's why it is, I would call it a brave move. One needs to think carefully before doing it. Kingside castling for Carpov1. We finished 5 moves, and what the score you see here, it is 0.0. Completely even. Let's continue. Thanos places his pawn to h3, perhaps wanting to stop a bishop coming to g4. Computer says that loses a pawn, and we're going to see how it loses a pawn. Carpov1 is going to miss a chance. You see here, the pawn would have lost if knight goes to e4. And in case you wonder, wanted knight takes the knight on e4, yes, but then Carpov1, let's do it again. Knight goes here, and then Carpov1 sends his pawn, and there is a double attack. I don't think that Carpov1 will really take a pawn, but the material will be even after the exchanges, but clearly Carpov1 has a great position after that. Instead, Carpov1 places his knight to d7, inaccuracy. This is a little bit scary movie sometimes, not in this opening, but in other openings, placing the bishop on d7, it hides the bishop on c8, and so leaves a lot of squares unprotected because the bishop from c8 cannot reach them, and quite a few times there are combinations taking advantage. White makes a small sacrifice and ends up winning the game. I've won some games like that in about 10-15 moves because of a knight misplaced on d7. Thanos places queen on d2. Maybe wants to get rid of the bishop on g7 after placing the bishop on h6. Pawn to c6 for Carpov1. More pressure on the d5 square. Bishop to h6 for Thanos, that wants to exchange to get rid of the dark-colored bishop of Carpov1. And since the pawn has been moved to g6 and g7 to g6, the bishop of g7 plays the role of the pawn, meaning controlling f6 and h6, and if this disappears, white has an advantage. Not yet winning or significant, but a small advantage that, together with other advantages, may give the win to the white. But let's see what will happen. Pawn to e5 for Carpov1. This is called the pawn push. Now, Thanos takes the pawn. Computer would rather have the bishop exchange. What's going to happen is, if Carpov1 takes the bishop here, then Thanos takes it and queen is on h6. Carpov1, of course, cannot move the bishop to h8 because then the rook is lost. But for the time being, Thanos can take the bishop. King takes back, of course, but slightly weakens the black king's position. Thanos will postpone it, although the computer doesn't agree, takes on e5. Carpov1 takes back with a knight. Computer would rather have the pawn taking back. And now time to exchange the bishops on g7. And we completed the first moves. And what is the score? Thanos is leading by 0.4. You can see it at the bottom left. Here, 0.46 to be exact if you want the second decimal. This is Thanos' advantage. Very small, doesn't yet decide anything. Bishop to e2 for Thanos. The reason being is that after Carpov1 plays his knight on e5, it's attacking the bishop on c4. So Thanos has to do something about it. And he plays what the computer thinks the best move. That's what the star means. By the way, the indications, a positive number means, or a number at the bottom left here means white is doing better. A number at the top left means black is doing better. Also, the computer is going to comment, quote unquote, comment on the moves with various symbols. 2 exclamation points is the best. It's a brilliant move. One exclamation point is it's a great. A star means the best possible. If you see thumbs up, it's excellent. If you see a check mark, it's a good. And if you see question mark and exclamation point, it's inaccuracy. Question mark, it is a mistake, and two question marks is a blunder. That is how the computer comments on the moves. And an arrow shows the best possible move. Queen to c7 for Carpov1. Computer doesn't like it. Question mark means a mistake. Would rather have the pawn go to b5 and then attack the net on, if it moves to b4. But the problem is that the moment that you move your pawn to b5, the c6 pawn is unprotected. It's not attacked yet, but you don't want to have unprotected pawns or pieces unless there's a good reason otherwise. Let's see how game continues. Knight to 3 for Thanos. Computer wants the pawn to go to f4, from f2 to f4 and attack the knight. And the knight being on f3, white's knight on f3 blocks the pawn. Bishop to e6. Knight to g5 for Thanos. Great moves is a computer. In fact, not the great, but the best possible. That's what the star indicates. Queen to b6 for Carpov1. Attacks the pawn on b2. Of course, this may end up being a poisonous pawn, because if black takes it, white can place the rook on b. Let's do it again. White can place the rook on b1, attack the queen, supported by the knight on c3. Queen can go to a3, the only square. Then you may have the the rook going to b3. And while white is developing the pieces, black has to continue moving the queen to keep it safe. That is why one has to think very carefully before taking the b2 pawn if he decides to take it. And now, knight from g5 takes on e6 for Thanos. Computer once again wants a pawn to go to f4. Second time, it decides that this is the best possible move for white. Of course, pawn takes back for Carpov1, no other choice. Knight to a4 attacks the queen. And for the third time, the computer wants the pawn to go to f4 for white as the best move. It attacks the queen, but queen will go back to c7. We finished 15 moves, and the score is once again 0.00. Very even, a very exciting game is going to follow. Let's see what's going to happen. Not to follow, but to continue. It has already started. And believe it or not, after 3 times that the computer was begging Thanos to place the pawn on f4, now that Thanos is doing it, computer says it is a blunder. From 0.00, black Carpov1 has an advantage of 1.8. Why? Why is it now a blunder before it was the best move? Carpov1 misses it. What's going to happen is, because the knight left c3 is on a4, the pawn on e4 is undefended. So the best possible move for Carpov1 was disregard the attack on the knight, take the pawn on e4 and attack the queen. So no time to take the knight on e5. White will have to find something to do with the queen. But no matter. But if the queen goes, for example, here to protect the pawn, queen can go to a5 with a check. So the computer believes that it's better if black would temporarily disregard the threat on the knight on e5 and instead take the e4 pawn. But that's not what happens, as we saw. Knight goes to d7, knight is safe, but the chance to get the pawn is missed. Bishop to d3 for Thanos protects the pawn on e4. Computer would rather have the knight go back to c3. Of course, you don't like the knight to be on the edge of the board. Here it controls only 4 squares. Let's see, the 1, 2, 3, 4, instead of the 8 that you control on c3, for example. And as I say, a knight on the rim is grim and ready for the trim. Let's continue. Knight to h5 for Carpov1. That Exert pressure on f4. Look at it. It's attacked twice by the rook and by the knight, and defended only once by the queen. And that is why Thanos will place his rook on f1, second defense. Now the pawn on f4 for the time being is safe, although the computer would rather have Thanos castle kingside. Again, the rook would go on f1, but the king would have gone to g1, a little bit safer. Pawn to d5 for Carpov1, great move, says the computer. Now the queen of c7 is also attacking the pawn. Pawn to f5 for Thanos is safeguarding the f-pawn, but Carpov1 will take it. Queen to c3 check from Thanos. King to g8 for Carpov1. We finished 20 moves, and now Carpov1 is ahead by a pawn materially, but overall is ahead by 2.9 or 2.98, almost 3 points overall according to the computer. Let's see how game continues. It seems now things are going Black's way, Carpov1's way. Pawn takes 25. Queen to g3 check, and Carpov1 is approaching the white king with the queen only 2 squares diagonally far away. King goes to d2. Queen to g2. Check. Again, black is ahead in material after white equalized after taking the pawn on d5. Bishop to e2. Computer wants the king to go to c1. Yes, on c1 the king is safe, but how about the rook on a1? It has nowhere to go. Maybe that's what Thanos was thinking. And of course, I have no idea what Thanos was thinking at the game, but I'll try to tell you what I would have been thinking in his place and the reason for choosing a particular move. This could be a good one. You want your rooks to communicate with each other and have as much space to go as possible. Queen to d5 takes another pawn check, is 2 pawns ahead. Computer thinks a miss, would rather have the knight go to g3 and attack the bishop on e2 a second time. Queen to d3, after the check. Queen to a5 check. Knight goes back to c3. Computer would rather have the computer go to c3, but think about it. If queen goes to c3, queen can take the knight. Of course, then queen can take the other knight, and one would have to think in depth what will happen after that. Attacks b7, but black, who knows? But Thanos played a human move. Knight goes back to c3, knight is safe, knight is not on the rim any longer. Knight goes to e5 for Carpov1 that attacks the white queen. Queen goes to e3. But before that, we finished 25 moves. What is the score? Carpov1 is leading by 5.6 or 5.64. The difference is enormous. It's more than a rook, and it seems that black is on his way to victory. But will that happen? You know, in chess, one needs to be careful until the very last moment. In other games, if you're ahead by a big margin, it's unlikely you're going to lose. If in soccer you lose by, you are ahead by 3 goals with 10 minutes remaining, it's very unlikely you're going to lose. But in chess, you're ahead by the equivalent of more than 5 goals, 5 points, and anything can happen. Queen goes to e3. We said now Thanos protects the queen. Rook goes to d8 check. King to c1. Finally, king goes back to c1. Rook on a1 is really dead at this point. It can only go to b1 next door, nothing else. And Carpov1 continues the attack. Pawn goes to f4. Attacks the white queen on e3. Queen escapes on e4. Knight to g3 for Carpov1 that has a fork. Attacks simultaneously the rook on f1 and the queen on e4. And so what can Thanos do? Queen goes to c2, to g2, and loses the exchange. No surprise here. So the material advantage of Carpov1 is +4, as you see here. And now, Carpov will play Carpov1, in fact, not Anatoly Karpov, the past world champion. We're talking about the player that has, quote-unquote, borrowed the name as user ID, Carpov1. He's going to play a move that the computer thinks is brilliant. Rook goes to d5. Why is it brilliant? First of all, it can easily be taken by the knight from c3. But if that happens, we have checkmate. Carpov1 brings the rook with a dangerous trap. Will Thanos fall for the trap? No, he doesn't. Queen goes to f2. Now, really, Carpov1 needs to think about his rook, because if he leaves it here, the next move is not made because queen can take queen. Rook goes to d6. Carpov1 saves his rook. Pawn to a4 for Thanos gives some space to his rook from a1 that at least can also move along the other line. Pawn to f3 for Carpov1. Pawn is 2 squares away from promotion. Of course, it's blocked by the queen on f2 and bishop on f1, but that could change. Knight to e4 for Thanos. Attacks the rook on d6. That's why Carpov1 sends it to d7. You can see here that if it was not for the rook on f8, Thanos has a fork if knight goes to f6. But currently this cannot happen because the rook of of f8. But really this means that the rook cannot leave the f file, the black rook. Pawn to b3 for Thanos, that opens the space, especially the king can go to b2, is not so constrained any longer. And if the king goes to b2, the rook on a1 has much more freedom. Rook to f4 for Carpov1 attacks the knight on e4. Knight goes to c5, attacks the rook on d7. Rook to e7, Carpov1 saves the rook. Even though the computer would rather have black sacrifice the rook and send the queen on c3 and attack the rook on e1. Excuse me, on a1. King to b2 for Thanos, finally giving more freedom for his rook on a1. The king on b2 may or may not be safe. This we'll see it later. But at least the rook on a1 is not off the game any longer. But before we do that, we finished 35 moves. What is the score? Carpov1 is leading by 5.11. King to b2 for Thanos. And look what's happening. If it was not for the pawn on c3 and the knight on c5, excuse me, the pawn on c2 and the knight on c5, the knight from e4 could go to square d3 with the royal fork, as it's called, attacking simultaneously king and queen. But that's not yet the case. Pawn to b6 for Carpov1, that wants at least to send away the knight. Knight goes to d3. And if it was not for the pawn on c2, Carpov1 would have the royal fork. But Carpov1 takes a knight in any case. Bishop takes back on d3. Yes, we forgot also the bishop from f1 defended d3. Queen to h5 for Carpov1, threatening the pawn on h3. Queen to g3 saves it and attacks the rook on f4. Queen to h4 protects a rook. And now Thanos is in a dilemma. Exchange queens or not. Carpov1 has +4 material, which is wonderful. And usually when you're ahead, you want to exchange. When you're behind, you don't. But what can Thanos do with the queen if he decides not to exchange? The only safe square as would be g1 and h2. But then the pawn on f3 could continue its advance towards promotion. So Thanos thinks it's safer to exchange the queens. And we finished 40 moves. And what is the advantage of Carpov1? 5.43. Quite loud. It's been between 5 and 6 the last 10-15 moves. Bishop to f1 for Thanos, protects the pawn on h3 and also stops or makes much tougher for the pawn on f3 to be promoted. Rook to e4 for Carpov1. If he can change rooks, his pawn is much nearer promotion. Bishop to c4 with a check for Thanos. King to g7, Carpov. Rook to f1 for Thanos. Rook to e3 for Carpov1. gives more, yes, defends the pawn on f3, because before, when the rook was on f1, the pawn on f3 came under attack. Rook to f2 for Thanos, and rook to e5 for Carpov1, brings the other rook near. Bishop to f1 for Thanos, b5 for Carpov1, and wants to also to attack along the queen side. 3 versus 3 pawns, so it's neither minority nor a majority attack, but could create issues there. And of course, Carpov1 wants exchange. He's ahead by +4. If everything would disappear, we would end up having Carpov1, an extra exchange, and 2 extra pawns. Pawn to a5 for Thanos, that doesn't want to open the space, because then his thing is even more vulnerable, and of course doesn't want to exchange. Pawn to h5 for Carpov1, that starts attacking along the king side with the pawns. Pawn break there. Rook to d2 for Carpov1, perhaps want to check. Rook to e2 for Carpov1, that suggests for rook exchange. Now, you may think, what if Thanos takes the rook? Look at it. Then pawn takes the bishop, and the pawn is very near promotion, and white cannot have promotion. The only thing he can do is sacrifice the rook, and then we go to an ending where Carpov1 has an extra rook. That is why Thanos will try to postpone the disaster by sending his rook to e7, check, excuse me, to d7, and Carpov1 will reply with the rook to e7. So are we going to exchange rooks? That what is Thanos is suggesting, or that was the Carpov1 is suggesting, to be exact. And Thanos decides to take the other rook on e2. You see that the rook cannot take the bishop because of the pin, but the rook can take the rook. That's what Carpov1 should have done. And instead, while at this point, Karpov is ahead by 4.65, eventually he cracks under pressure and blunders and sends the king to f6. Now it is the other way around. 4.62, Thanos is ahead. This is a major blunder. And in case you wonder why did it happen, well, in chess, anything can happen. The pressure, the psychological pressure, is enormous. I've both suffered and have taken advantage of this pressure. So it's very easy being at home and watching it on a YouTube video to think that the player was stupid, but when you're sitting in front of the chessboard, the nerves are very, very tense. It's very easy to miss things. You're near victory and you know you have to be careful, and then you may collapse under the psychological pressure. And now Thanos doesn't miss his chance. He takes the rook on e7. Great moves the computer, but too obvious, I think, to be considered great. And Carpov1 is going to take back. We finished 50 moves, and now the game has completely changed dramatically. Just one move. 4.62, Thanos is ahead. And of course, still there's a pawn on f3 that one needs to deal with, and Thanos just grabs the pawn. King to d6. Pawn goes to b4 for Thanos, and pawn to c5 for Carpov1. What's happening is that Thanos has an extra bishop. And as far as pawns are concerned, 5 for Carpov1 and 4 for Thanos. Perhaps if Carpov1 overcomes a shock, might be able to get at least a draw with the pawns. Let's look at the pawns. The only one that can win the game for Thanos is the only ones are A, B, C, because the H3 is rook side and opposite color of the bishop. So what Carpov1 needs to do is grab these 3 pawns, and then has a draw as a very minimum. And perhaps that's what he's trying to do by sending the pawn to c5, because they have one of the 3 pawns goes away, and the other 2 are far from each other, and they are very vulnerable. But let's see what will happen. Thanos sends his king to b3, and we exchange on b4. And now Carpov1, it needs to grab the A and the B pawn, the A5 and the C2 pawns and has at least a draw. But will that happen? Pawn to A6 for Carpov1 and Thanos can set his bishop to B7 and attacks the pawn on A6, cannot be defended. And once it's gone, also the pawn on B5 cannot be gone. What can Carpov1 do? What I would do in his place? Push the pawns, hoping to exchange the H and the G pawn. You have one pawn going to promotions. It will not promote, but at least the bishop has to go back. And this could give some time for Carpov1 to think about winning the A and the C pawns. But that did not happen. Carpov1 resigned. Thanos, congratulations for your win, especially you are under such difficult position, being down by almost 6 points and still fighting until the end. And this was the game that Thanos wanted to share with us, with the channel. Thanos, thank you very much for that. Let's stop this showing the game. Now we're going to show to you the computer evaluation. But let me share the screen with you. Where are we now? Screens. Here we are. Here. What does the computer think about the overall game? Let's first of all read more carefully the comment of the coach, artificial intelligence coach. It can be hard to stay alert for endgame tactics, but why did it and won the game because of it? Yes, and was a little lucky because Black blundered. But it's one thing your opponent to blunder, and another thing for you to be alert and take advantage of the blunder. So Thanos, congratulations for your win. Great job. And let's see how did we do. Brilliance. Karpov 1 had one brilliancy when he plays his rook on d5, one great move each of them, four book moves, best 21 versus 17 for Karpov 1, excellent 17 versus 12 for Thanos, good 8 versus 4 for Karpov 1, and in the negatives, Thanos had 3 inaccuracies versus, 8 inaccuracies versus 2 for Karpov 1. One mistake for Thanos, two for Carpov 1, misses two each of them, and one blunder each of them. But Carpov 1's blunder with the king sent to f6 instead of recapturing the rook was the crucial that decided the game. Ratings, they played as if both of them were a little bit higher than their real ratings. Thanos as if his rating was 1600 and Carpov 1 as it was 1550. In the meantime, this concludes this game. What lies ahead? Ahead, we're going to have the bots. And for me, it is time to face the advanced bot Wally from Scotland that has a rating of 1800. If you've seen the votes with advanced over the beginner and intermediate bots, now face the advanced ones. We completed 10 out of the 20. Now Wally is number 11. His rating is 1800, but things are not so easy any longer because my United States Chess Federation rating, in spite of the success I had before, is just 1706, less than the 1800. And the chess.com ratings I have are not that much more than that. But let's also look at the tournaments that we've been following. The ones that participate in many tournaments, as you may see, but the ones I mostly care about is, first of all, the grecochess 64, the second tournament that I have organized, where until now we have 20 players that have registered out of the 64 that we need to start the tournament. The moment we hit 64, the tournament is starting. If you see here, the highest rated one is Guy Jordan with 2,103, a very high one. Let's see what's going to happen to that. the 2006 Chess.com Daily Chess Championship that started January 1st, and where I have already advanced to round number 2. How's it going? We need 5 games to complete round number 1. And these games, you see, the remaining games are very advanced, between 70 and 84 moves. Hopefully, it's not going to take a long time. And let's see the other one, organized by my Italian subscriber, Zanilor. Underwater Moonlight, the 9 Moons Tournament. We are in the third round, the semi-final. 12 players continue in 2 groups of 6. 3 advance from every group. From group 1, we know who has advanced. It is Mebius from Nigeria, Steam Rocket from Australia, and Chinan Fu from Greenland. They have already advanced formally. In the second group, officially, we don't know yet, but unofficially, we know what's going to happen, because only 1 game remains, and no matter what happens, we have Maxim Govoruka from the Ukraine, PG74 from Italy, and MMMT from Indonesia had advanced. Once this game between Maxim Govoruka and PG74 is over, we are going to have the final round with 6 finalists. But that's it for now. As we said, we are going to continue next video. Wally from Scotland. The next video. See how we're going to do. We're going to first play, I'm having the white pieces and Wally has the black. And the next video is going to be, I have the black and Wally has the white. Let's see what we can do there. Will we be able to overcome these 1800 rated bots? But for this video, that's it for now. I'm continuing producing the videos. After this break ahead, we'll have more videos. I'll try to have 1 video every day. Thanks to all the viewers, subscribers, the likes and the comments. This is Greco Chess. I'm your host, Karilaos Aniziris. Goodbye.